I want you to imagine, like, just for a second, that you're sitting across from a therapist. You've finally taken that massive and, I mean, incredibly vulnerable step to ask for help.
Right, which is huge in itself.
Oh, absolutely. So maybe this is after months or even years of just, internal debate,
Hmm.
and you're sitting on that notoriously comfortable couch. The tissues are right there, perfectly placed on the table, and you are just pouring your heart out.
Yeah.
You're talking about the absolute biggest life challenge you're facing right now. And the therapist, who, by the way, has a wall completely covered in advanced degrees and certifications, they just fundamentally misinterpret everything you're saying.
It happens so much more often than people think.
Right. They look at your struggle, which is deeply rooted in your cultural context or your community or your socioeconomic background,
Yeah.
and they literally label it as a personal failing.
Yeah, they pathologize it.
Exactly. They pathologize a perfectly normal reaction to an abnormal environment. So they diagnose you, they prescribe a fix based on some textbook that wasn't even written with you in mind, and they completely, utterly miss you.
I mean, it's a profoundly alienating experience. And what makes it so, well, so tragic, really, is that it happens every single day.
Yeah.
And often at the hands of incredibly well-intentioned professionals. Like, we have this collective cultural assumption that therapy is this universal safe haven,
Right, like it's totally neutral.
Exactly. Like it's a completely objective space where human suffering is simply human suffering.
Yeah.
But the clinical reality is just, it's far more complicated.
Right.
The mental health field, the diagnostic manuals, the whole framework of what we consider psychologically healthy, it's historically been built on a very specific Western-centric middle-class foundation.
So it's biased from the ground up.
Basically, yeah. So when someone who doesn't naturally fit that demographic mold walks into the room, applying that rigid framework doesn't just fail to help them. It can actually replicate the exact systemic harm the client is, trying to heal from.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today's deep dive is venturing into a massive, frankly complex ecosystem of multicultural counseling competencies. We are going to deconstruct exactly how mental health professionals navigate, and sometimes just completely fail to navigate, the intersections of race, sexuality, disability, immigration, and poverty.
And it is a lot of ground to cover.
It is. And I have to tell you, digging into these clinical frameworks, it's eye-opening, not just for therapists, but for anyone, really, who's trying to understand human connection. We are going to extract the exact aha moments that shortcut the path to true cultural humility. And I promise you, this isn't going to be some dry academic exercise.
Yeah, no.
We're talking about the invisible scripts that dictate, like, everyday human interactions.
Right. And understanding those scripts requires us to look way beyond the surface level. Our goal today isn't just to memorize some checklist of what different marginalized groups face.
Yeah, that's such an outdated way to look at it.
It really is. We're going to explore the why. Like, why does traditional Western-centric therapy so often misfire when it's applied to diverse populations? And more importantly, how can adopting an ecosystemic view, which basically means looking at the client's entire world, their community, their socioeconomic reality, rather than just their internal psychology, how can that completely revolutionize the landscape of mental health?
But I feel like before we even get to how to counsel specific populations, we have to address this massive psychological roadblock.
The resistance.
Yes, the resistance. We have to understand why simply learning about these populations or even just having these conversations causes so much psychological friction.
Oh, it's huge.
There is this intense, almost visceral pushback in therapists going through training and really in society at large whenever concepts like oppression, systemic bias, and privilege are brought up. Like, it's not a polite disagreement, it's a biological reaction.
It is a very real, well-documented phenomenon. When members of a dominant or majority group are confronted with the realities of systemic bias, it routinely triggers intense emotional and physiological reactions.
Like actual physical reactions.
Yeah, absolutely. We are talking about severe cognitive, emotional, and behavioral resistance. People experience acute anxiety, defensiveness, profound guilt, or just a full-blown fight-or-flight response.
Wow.
The nervous system literally interprets the information as a threat to survival.
Which is such a fascinating juxtaposition, right? Because for marginalized individuals, encountering that exact same information often triggers the complete opposite response.
Right, profound relief.
Exactly. Think about, like, a Latina student sitting in that exact same lecture hall, listening to a breakdown of systemic biases. She finally hears someone articulate this invisible, suffocating weight she's been carrying her entire life.
It's validating.
Yeah, it's the validation of realizing, wait, I'm not crazy. The system is actually rigged. But then the person sitting next to her is completely shutting down.
Exactly. For the marginalized individual, it's external validation of an internal lived reality. But for the majority group member, it's an introduction of cognitive dissonance.
And the brain hates that.
The human brain despises cognitive dissonance.
Right.
So to resolve that discomfort, people instinctively reach for what we call benign explanation.
Okay, benign explanations.
Yeah, to rationalize away the stark reality of racism or systemic bias.
Let's ground that in a real scenario so you guys can picture it. Say a Puerto Rican couple is driving and they notice a police officer tailing them, like, extremely closely. And this goes on for miles. The cop only pulls away when they finally reach the safety of their hotel parking lot. They feel targeted, they feel anxious, and deeply, deeply unsafe.
Which makes perfect sense.
Right. But then when they recount this story, a listener, and this could even be a therapist in training, they instantly jump in with something like, oh, I'm sure the cop wasn't following you because of your race. Your hotel was probably just on the way to the police station.
And that response right there, that is a textbook defense mechanism.
Really? Just deflecting it like that?
Yeah, and it's not necessarily driven by malice.
Yeah.
You know, it's driven by a desperate need to keep the listener's worldview in equilibrium.
Ah, I see.
If the listener accepts that the police officer was actually engaging in racial profiling, it threatens a fundamental, deeply comforting belief that society is basically just.
Right, that authority figures are inherently fair.
Exactly. And that bad things only happen to people who deserve them.
So it's the just world hypothesis. But it reminds me of an analogy, like, think about the psychological immune system reacting to the truth of oppression, kind of like a body reacting to a localized infection.
Okay, I like that.
The truth enters the system, and instead of integrating it, the psyche treats it as a foreign invader. It sends white blood cells, which in this case are denial, benign explanations, and defensiveness, to attack the truth, wall it off, and just eliminate the discomfort.
That's exactly how it works.
But here's the thing. By neutralizing the discomfort, you prevent any actual growth. It's like physical therapy on a bad joint. It hurts so incredibly bad before it heals, and your first instinct is to pull away.
Right.
But what I want to push you on, though, is the severity of this reaction. Because if someone specifically enters the helping profession because they possess high empathy and they genuinely want to heal people, why is the realization of their own blind spots so utterly terrifying?
Well, what's fascinating here is that acknowledging systemic racism, sexism, or ableism directly challenges a person's most closely guarded asset,
Which is,
their moral self-image.
oh, wow.
Yeah. Most people who enter counseling, or really anyone who considers themselves a good citizen, they deeply want to believe they are moral, decent, objective human beings.
Right. Nobody wants to be the bad guy.
Exactly. So when you introduce the idea that they might hold unconscious biases, or that their very existence benefits from a system that actively disadvantages someone else, it doesn't feel like an academic critique to them.
It feels personal.
It feels like a devastating personal attack on their character.
It feels like you're telling them their goodness is a lie.
Precisely. And this leads to profound guilt and the absolute terror of being labeled with the R word.
Racist.
Right. That fear of the label actually paralyzes people. It leads directly to behavioral resistance.
What does that look like in practice?
In a classroom, a boardroom, or a clinical training setting, you'll see this manifest as complete, utter silence.
Just shutting down.
Yeah. The majority group members become so terrified of saying the wrong thing, of unintentionally offending someone, or just revealing their own ignorance, that they freeze. They refuse to engage.
And the irony is that silence isn't harmless at all. By freezing up just to protect their own ego, they place the entire burden of education back onto the marginalized people in the room.
Exactly.
So the marginalized individuals are then left to do the heavy, exhausting, emotional labor of explaining their own oppression, while everyone else just sits comfortably in their protective silence.
It's a complete abdication of responsibility, but, breaking through that paralysis is possible. It just requires immense vulnerability.
Are there any good examples of someone actually doing that?
Yeah, psychologist Mark Kaselica provides this brilliant, really transparent account of his own journey through this exact resistance.
Oh, I think I read about this. This was in the 80s, right?
But right. Back in the 1980s, as a white doctoral candidate, he was required to read a foundational textbook on multicultural counseling just to pass his comprehensive exams.
And you didn't want to?
Well, he openly admits he only bought it because he had to. He thought he was already this culturally sensitive, open-minded guy.
Right.
But as he read, He was hit with an overwhelming wave of disgust and anger. He felt personally attacked.
Really? By a textbook?
Yeah, he felt the authors were just bashing white America and unfairly blaming him for a historical legacy of racism that he felt he had absolutely zero personal part in.
Wow, that is such a raw, honest admission, because that is the exact internal monologue so many people have, but they're far too ashamed to ever say it out loud.
Absolutely.
He genuinely resented the material, but the turning point is that he couldn't just close the book and walk away, right?
Mhm.
Because his degree depended on it. He had to sit with that intense, burning discomfort.
And as he sat with it, that fight-or-flight response slowly began to metabolize. He forced himself to look inward, to genuinely reflect on his own life, and he had a painful but necessary breakthrough.
What did he realize?
He realized he had unknowingly bought into racist stereotypes. He had laughed at racist jokes to fit in. He recognized that while he wasn't the original architect of the oppressive system, he was undeniably a product of it.
Right.
And by remaining blissfully blind to how the system operated, he was passively ensuring its survival.
He had to dismantle the myth of his own absolute innocence in order to actually become an effective therapist.
Yes.
He had to accept that you can be a good person and still be complicit in a flawed system.
That realization is the bedrock of cultural competence. Before you can ever hope to understand the worldview of a client whose lived experience is drastically different from yours, you have to relentlessly, uncomfortably examine the architecture of your own worldview.
You have to know what lenses you're wearing before you look through them.
Beautifully put, yes.
Okay, so now that we've established this internal psychological friction, let's explore what actually happens in the therapy room when a clinician hasn't done that internal work.
Oh, this is where it gets messy.
Yeah, when they rigidly apply their own reality to a client whose reality operates on a completely different frequency. The clinical world breaks this down into etic versus emic perspectives.
Right.
And I know that sounds like high-level academic jargon, but it literally dictates the success or failure of almost every cross-cultural interaction.
It is essential terminology. So an etic perspective, that's ETIC, assumes that psychological concepts are universally applicable across all cultures.
Like a one-size-fits-all thing.
Exactly. It operates on the assumption that Western, Eurocentric standards of normality, abnormality, and healthy human development apply equally to everyone on the globe.
Okay, and emic.
An emic perspective, conversely, is culturally specific. It recognizes that lifestyles, cultural values, and sociopolitical contexts fundamentally shape not only how human beings express distress, but how they define healing itself.
Let's look at a concrete and frankly incredibly tense example of how a purely etic approach just totally sabotages the session.
Let's do it.
So consider this therapy transcript involving a white therapist, we'll call him Dr. D, and his client, Gabriela, who is a 29-year-old Latina woman who immigrated to the U.S. from Brazil as a child.
Okay.
Gabriela comes into the session highly distressed. She describes this massive, escalating argument with her white boyfriend over a Jennifer Lopez music video, specifically the song Booty.
I know the one.
Right. So Gabriela found the video vulgar and degrading, but her boyfriend kept watching it on a repeat, completely ignoring her discomfort. The argument spirals, and Gabriela describes having what she calls an attack.
An attack, yes.
She says she started screaming, throwing dishes, crying uncontrollably. She couldn't breathe. She felt this intense heat rising in her chest, and she experienced a sense of unreality, like she might faint.
And how does Dr. D process this highly charged narrative?
Well, he immediately defaults to his diagnostic manual. He diagnoses her with a panic attack, just like that.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. He asks if she tried her deep breathing relaxation exercises to nip it in the bud. And then he casually suggests they might need to look into psychiatric medication to help her control her emotional outbursts.
Which is a clinical failure on multiple levels.
Right.
Dr. D is looking at Gabriela purely through an analytic lens. He hears a cluster of physiological symptoms: crying, shortness of breath, a feeling of unreality, and he lazily maps them onto the Western DSM diagnosis of a panic disorder.
But she didn't say she had a panic attack.
Exactly. She explicitly used the cultural term attacks. She was describing ataque de nervios, which is a widely documented, culturally recognized syndrome in many Latin American cultures.
It's not just the Spanish word for panic attack.
No, not at all. It is a culturally specific response to acute distress, often involving interpersonal conflict or family grief. It's not simply a translation.
That makes so much sense. And the psychological drivers are totally different. Like a panic attack in the Western sense often centers around a fear of dying or a fear of losing one's mind, and it often just comes out of nowhere.
Right, out of the blue.
But a tacta nerviosa is usually triggered by a severe disruption in the social or familial fabric. But Dr. D misses this entirely.
Completely misses it.
And when Gabriella tries to explain that she feels fundamentally misunderstood, that her boyfriend is dismissing her as a typical emotional Latina, and that her parents are warning her that she's just being used as an exotic fetish by this white guy, Dr. D completely dismisses her cultural context.
Oh, it's worse.
Yeah. He tells her she needs to individuate. He advises her to ignore her parents, to be her own person, and actually tells her that under the skin we are all the same.
Ugh, under the skin we are all the same is the ultimate etic cop-out.
It really is.
It is a form of cultural oppression disguised as therapeutic wisdom. Dr. D is aggressively imposing Eurocentric goals onto his client.
How so?
Well, in Western psychotherapy, the ultimate pinnacle of human development is almost always autonomy, radical independence, and extreme emotional regulation. But those are not universal human truths. They are culture-bound values.
It's like my one-size-fits-all t-shirt analogy. If you try to force a collectivist mindset into an individualist therapy model, you're gonna tear the fabric. You can't navigate the dense Amazon rainforest using a subway map of New York City.
That is a perfect analogy. The map is accurate for where it was designed, but applying it to this new environment isn't just unhelpful, it will actively leave you into danger.
But let me push back on this a little, because I think a lot of people listening who grew up in Western environments might inherently agree with Dr. D.
Sure.
Even if his delivery was terrible, isn't independence objectively the healthiest outcome? Shouldn't a 29-year-old adult be making romantic decisions completely separate from her parents' opinions? Like, does enmeshment ever actually serve a positive purpose?
And that is the exact Western bias we had to deconstruct. If we look at how different cultures define optimal development, the picture changes entirely.
Okay, tell me more.
In mainstream U.S. culture, individuation and separating from the family of origin is prized. But in many Asian American cultures, for example, a strict self-orientation is actually viewed as immature and undesirable.
Really? Immature?
Yes, there's a Japanese proverb, "The nail that stands up should be pounded back down." It illustrates that psychological maturity is achieved by considering the harmony and needs of the collective group over your own individual desires.
Oh, wow.
Similarly, in many Latinx cultures, the concept of familismo, which is a profound, lifelong dedication and loyalty to the extended family network, is not enmeshment, is a core source of psychological resilience, identity, and mutual survival.
So when Dr. D flippantly tells Gabriella to just ignore her parents and be her own person, he's not giving her objective medical advice. He's actually demanding that she violate a core sustaining cultural value in order to be deemed healthy by his narrow standards.
Precisely, and this misapplication of norms happens constantly across various demographics.
Give me another example.
For instance, African American clients are routinely pathologized for emotive, passionate, and direct interpersonal communication styles. A Western therapist who is trained to value stoic clinical detachment might misread a passionate client as aggressive, defensive, or lacking emotional regulation.
It's a massive translation error, and it applies to therapeutic modalities too, like standard cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Yes, the gold standard in Western psychology.
Right. It relies heavily on compartmentalizing thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. But for many American, Indian, and Alaska Native clients, particularly those holding traditional rural worldviews, this compartmentalization is deeply alienating.
Completely unnatural.
Because traditional indigenous healing views the mind, body, and spirit as an interconnected, indivisible whole. Trying to isolate a cognitive distortion from spiritual well-being just feels highly unnatural.
And we also have to consider multiracial populations who face an incredibly unique set of psychological hurdles.
Oh, absolutely.
They frequently navigate phenotypic ambiguity, meaning how they physically present to the world doesn't neatly align with one specific racial category.
Right, so people are always trying to figure them out.
Exactly. They deal with constant invalidation, the exhausting "what are you" questions, and painful rejection from multiple social reference groups who demand they choose a side or prove their authenticity. A therapist using a monocultural etic lens will completely miss the chronic stress of living in that liminal space.
Speaking of liminal spaces, let's look at how these cultural clashes impact adolescence. The concept of feminismo creates intense acculturation conflicts for Latinx
It's a
teenagers.
very difficult tightrope to walk.
It is. They spend all day in American schools where they are relentlessly pushed toward Western autonomy, self-expression, and individualism. But when they bring that striving home, it creates severe, explosive discord with their more traditional parents.
Because the expectations are completely contradictory.
Exactly. The very structure that is supposed to be their ultimate protective factor, the family unit, morphs into a source of unbearable distress because these two diametrically opposed cultural scripts are colliding.
Which is exactly why an ecosystemic assessment is not optional. It is vital.
Mhm.
A culturally competent clinician doesn't just assess the neurochemistry of the individual's brain. They assess the entire ecosystem, the family dynamic, the community expectations, the societal pressures, and the historical context.
You cannot treat the fish without evaluating the water it swims in.
Beautifully said.
That sets up our next major exploration perfectly. We've been discussing domestic racial and ethnic groups, dealing with generational systemic realities within a single national context. But when you add the literal crossing of geopolitical borders to the equation,
The therapeutic landscape changes entirely.
it really does. We move from navigating systemic bias to addressing acute geopolitical displacement, profound cultural shock, and the severing of one's roots. We need to talk about immigrants and refugees.
And it is crucial that we distinguish between the two, because while they share the challenge of a new environment, the psychological baseline is often fundamentally different.
Break that down for us.
Well, the literature generally breaks the migration journey into three distinct phases: pre-migration, transit, and resettlement. For many immigrants, the pre-migration phase allows for some level of agency. There is time for planning, saying goodbyes, and psychological preparation for the transition.
So there's a choice involved.
Right. For refugees, however, the pre-migration phase is usually defined by terror. The departure is almost always sudden, traumatic, and driven by a desperate, immediate need to survive war, political persecution, or genocide.
The level of trauma associated with refugee populations is just staggering. We are talking about individuals who have endured the unimaginable, witnessing systemic violence, surviving sexual assault, seeing their homes destroyed, and losing family members.
And the clinical outcomes reflect this severity. The rates of complex PTSD, debilitating nightmares, hypervigilance, and severe dissociation in refugee populations dwarf those found in the general public.
But what I find incredibly complex from a clinical perspective is how this trauma actually presents itself in the room. Many immigrants and refugees exhibit a somatic view of psychological distress.
Yes, somaticization.
Meaning they don't walk in and say, I am experiencing clinical depression. They experience and report their psychological anguish as severe physical pain.
It's incredibly common. In many cultures globally, the rigid Cartesian dualism of Western medicine, this idea that the mind and the body are two completely separate, distinct entities, it simply does not exist.
Right.
Distress is holistic. Therefore, deep psychological terror or unresolved grief might manifest as chronic, debilitating stomach pains, blinding headaches, or absolute physical exhaustion.
But practically speaking, how does a therapist navigate that? Let's say an immigrant client comes into a community clinic complaining of agonizing stomach pain, but the therapist, reading their file, knows this is actually the somatic manifestation of trauma from a brutal migration journey. How do you bridge that gap?
It's delicate.
Right, because you can't just look at a client who is in genuine physical agony and say, actually, your stomach is fine, it's just in your head.
Oh, if a therapist says that, they will lose the client, permanently and rightfully so, because it is incredibly dismissive.
So what's the alternative?
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the therapeutic alliance, a culturally competent therapist knows that they must validate the somatic complaint first. You do not challenge the physical reality of their pain, you lean into it.
Okay.
You might say, these stomach pains sound absolutely exhausting and terrifying to live with. Let's talk about exactly when they started and how they affect your day. By taking your physical reality seriously, you establish baseline trust.
You join them in their reality before asking them to join yours.
Exactly. Only after that trust is firmly established can the therapist slowly begin to introduce a psychological framing.
How would they do that?
They might gently explain how extreme, chronic stress like fleeing a country floods the nervous system with cortisol, which can actually cause the digestive system to malfunction and produce real physical pain.
Oh, so you explain the biology.
Yes. This normalizes their experience. It provides a bridge between the physical and the psychological, ensuring the client doesn't feel like they're being called crazy.
There is an incredible case study regarding a South Asian immigrant named Asma that illustrates this holistic approach so well. Asma is dealing with intense hostility in her new American environment. She has early experiences of trauma from her home country, and she is in the middle of severe intergenerational conflict with her highly Americanized teenage daughter.
That's a lot for one person to carry.
It is. But Asma's primary coping strategy, the mechanism keeping her tethered to reality, is pouring absolutely every ounce of her energy into preserving her identity as a fiercely protective, loving mother.
And Asma's case forces us to redefine what psychological resilience looks like.
How so?
Well, a traditional etiquette-focused Western therapist might evaluate Asma and conclude that she is using her daughter to avoid processing her own trauma. They'd say she's dangerously enmeshed and that she needs to focus on her own individual self-actualization.
Right, the classic Western goal.
Exactly. But through an ecosystemic lens, her fierce dedication to her maternal role is a profoundly culturally congruent coping mechanism. It is the anchor holding her life together.
So you don't mess with the anchor.
A skilled therapist doesn't try to strip that anchor away in the name of Western individualism. They recognize it as her primary source of strength and help her build a stable foundation upon it.
It fundamentally changes the metric of what success looks like in therapy. For decades, the implicit goal of immigrating to the West was assimilation. You know, that whole melting pot idea that success meant shedding your old culture and becoming entirely indistinguishable from the dominant culture.
Which we now know is incredibly harmful.
Right. Clinical data shows that assimilation is actually highly psychologically damaging. Success is about helping the client negotiate a bicultural identity.
Exactly.
And that means a therapist has to be perfectly comfortable encouraging a client to utilize indigenous healing practices, whether that is Ayurveda, consulting a traditional healer, or engaging in community prayer right alongside, or even instead of Western talk therapy.
Because forced assimilation requires a traumatic psychological severing of one's roots. It tells the client that their history is invalid. Biculturalism, on the other hand, allows for the integration of both worlds. It allows the individual to adapt to the new environment without annihilating their core identity.
We are going to pivot our focus slightly here. Just as immigrants and refugees must learn to survive in new, often hostile physical environments, there are marginalized groups who must navigate deeply entrenched, historically hostile societal environments every single day. I'm talking about the invisible but rigid structures of patriarchy and heterosexism that dictate incredibly strict rules for how bodies and identities are allowed to exist. Let's examine how culturally competent therapy approaches women and LGBTQ plus clients.
When we look at the history of counseling women, the advent of feminist therapy approaches provided a revolutionary paradigm shift.
How did it change things?
Historically, if a woman presented in therapy with symptoms of severe depression, chronic anxiety, or low self-esteem, traditional psychoanalysis looked inward. It searched for an internal pathology, a biological weakness, or a failure in psychosexual development.
They blamed her.
Essentially, yes. Feminist therapy completely obliterated that script. It posited that these psychological symptoms are not internal flaws to be cured, but rather the direct, logical, and inevitable result of a woman's subordinate, marginalized status within a patriarchal society.
It shifts the fundamental question of therapy from what is wrong with you to what has been done to you.
Yes, exactly.
You aren't depressed because your brain is broken. You are depressed because you are carrying the cognitive load of a household facing the wage gap and dealing with everyday sexism. It externalizes the problem. And this structural lens applies incredibly heavily to LGBTQ plus clients who are navigating a society saturated in heterosexist bias. And that bias isn't just external, it often seeps right into the therapy room.
Unfortunately, yes. Heterosexist bias in therapy can manifest as in subtle but damaging ways.
Like what?
It can be a therapist immediately assuming a new client is heterosexual and asking a female client about her husband.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Or it can be a clinician viewing a client's fluid or nonconforming sexuality as a developmental phase they will eventually mature out of. Or assuming that the gay client's psychological distress must inherently be linked to their sexual orientation, ignoring all other aspects of their life.
This brings up a critical theoretical distinction in how we even define sexuality. The frameworks break down sexual orientation and sexual identity SOSI into two opposing viewpoints, essentialism versus constructivism.
This is a huge distinction.
Yeah. Essentialism is the view most of us grew up with. It is the belief that sexual orientation is an innate, fixed, purely biological reality. You are born a certain way, and you fit neatly and permanently into a specific, predefined box: gay, straight, or bisexual.
Right.
Constructivism, however, argues that sexual identity is highly fluid, socially constructed, and deeply influenced by historical, cultural, and interpersonal contexts.
And this changes everything about how we approach therapy.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Think about societal gender norms and sexual identities as a rigid script handed to you the moment you were born. Society expects you to read your lines exactly as they are written, without improvisation.
Right.
The conflict arises when you realize the lines don't fit you. How does a therapist actually help a client realize they have the power to write their own script, especially when diverging from the assigned script might mean facing severe rejection from their family or community?
That tension right there is the breeding ground for internalized homophobia and internalized transphobia.
Explain how that works.
This occurs when an individual absorbs the toxic, biased, heteronormative scripts of the dominant culture and unconsciously turns them inward on themselves. They begin to believe the prejudice. They feel inherent shame.
So they're attacking themselves.
Exactly. A culturally competent therapist's primary job is to help the client externalize those scripts, to identify that the shame they feel does not originate from within themselves, but was placed upon them by a biased society.
But the work isn't just about internal self-acceptance. We have to talk about the external reality. There is a pervasive myth in modern progressive Western culture that coming out publicly is always the ultimate necessary endpoint of a healthy queer journey.
Oh, this is such a critical point.
We see it in media constantly, the triumphant coming out story. But for many clients, pushing that narrative is incredibly dangerous.
It is highly dangerous, and pushing it is a sign of immense clinical privilege.
Privilege, how so?
For a long time, the clinical assumption was that psychological health required complete public authenticity at all times. But a culturally competent therapist understands that physical safety and socioeconomic consequences must be weighed heavily.
Ah, I see.
For a teenager, coming out might result in immediate homelessness, physical violence, or being completely cut off from financial support for education. In certain highly traditional cultural or religious communities, it could mean permanent exile from their entire support network.
That's devastating.
Therapy should never force a client into physical or structural danger simply to satisfy a Western ideal of living your truth. Sometimes survival requires compartmentalization, and the therapist must validate that choice.
There is a complex case study about a client named Katrina that really highlights the necessity of the constructivist fluid approach. Katrina feels incredibly invalidated, not just by straight heteronormative society, but ironically by her own LGBTQ plus friends.
Which happens a lot.
Her friends view her queer identity through a very rigid essentialist lens. They want to force her into a recognizable box. Because Katrina presents as somewhat masculine in her dress, her friends expect her to fit a very specific butch stereotype, including who she should date.
Right.
But Katrina's actual desires are fluid. She's attracted to women who take the lead, but she is also deeply attracted to men who value her personality and strength over her gender presentation.
Katrina is experiencing intense distress because everyone around her, even her own marginalized community, is demanding that she pick a fixed label and adhere to its rules.
So what does a good therapist do in that situation?
A skilled therapist, operating from a culturally humble position, would never try to help Katrina find the right box. Instead, they would actively explore the fluidity of her identity.
Like breaking it down.
Yeah, they would help her deconstruct the separate components of human sexuality desire, physical arousal, biological sex, and emotional attraction, showing her that these are all independent moving variables. The therapeutic goal is to validate that her identity doesn't have to make sense to her friends. It only has to be authentic and functional for her.
And doing that requires the therapist to be an active participant. We hear a lot about microaggressions, those everyday, subtle, often unintentional slights and insults that marginalized people endure constantly. But the literature introduces the concept of microinterventions.
I love this concept.
A microintervention is the active antidote. It occurs when an ally, or in this case a therapist, actively and explicitly steps in to validate a person's experiential reality and affirm their identity the moment a microaggression is discussed. It is moving from a stance of passive neutrality to active affirmation.
Because in the context of therapy, appearing neutral in the face of systemic oppression is almost always perceived by the client as endorsing the status quo.
Silence is complicity.
Absolutely. If a client mentions experiencing a racial or homophobic microaggression and the therapist stays perfectly silent, nods neutrally, or changes the subject back to the client's internal feelings, the client immediately learns a crucial lesson. This room is not a safe place to discuss my marginalization. Active validation is required to build the alliance.
We spent a lot of time discussing invisible societal scripts. Now, we need to shift our focus to society's physical, structural, and architectural scripts. Let's dive deeply into counseling individuals with disabilities.
This is such a vital topic.
Because here, you are dealing with a profound intersection. The psychological hurdles of living in a world that is quite literally physically not constructed for your body.
It is a massive, incredibly diverse population that is frequently, almost systematically overlooked in standard diversity and inclusion discussions. The literature grounds this discussion in the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, signed in 1990. But it's vital to remember that the ADA was not a benevolent gift handed down by politicians. It was a civil rights victory fought for tooth and nail by disabled activists.
The Capitol crawl. I had never learned about this in standard history classes, and it is such a visceral, undeniable moment of protest.
It's iconic.
In March of 1990, hundreds of individuals with disabilities gathered at the U.S. Capitol building in Washington, D.C. They left their wheelchairs at the bottom, set aside their crutches and walkers, and literally physically crawled up the 83 stone steps of the Capitol building.
Just an incredible display of resilience.
It was a visual, undeniable demonstration of the physical barriers they faced every single day in a society that refused to accommodate them.
It is a powerful historical moment. And from a clinical perspective, that demonstration perfectly encapsulates the ideological shift from the medical model of disability to the minority model of disability.
Now, let's really debate these two models, because if you stop the average person on the street, they're going to think the medical model makes complete logical sense.
Sure they would.
The medical model says, if a body part is injured, or someone is born with a condition that deviates from the typical human baseline, the logical goal is to try to heal, cure, or rehabilitate them, right? That's just basic medicine. Where does that become psychologically dangerous in a therapy setting?
This raises an important question about where we fundamentally locate the problem.
Okay.
The medical model internalizes the problem entirely within the individual. It dictates that the disability is a personal defect, a tragic flaw within the person that needs to be cured, fixed, or rehabilitated to approximate normalcy as closely as possible.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Now, obviously, medical care, physical therapy, and symptom management are vital. But when a mental health professional solely utilizes this medical model, they inadvertently but powerfully send the message to the client that they are inherently broken, defective, and less than.
Yeah.
And that their ultimate goal in life should be to fix themselves.
They become a problem to be solved rather than a person to be understood.
Exactly. The minority model of disability, however, radically externalizes the problem. It argues that the physical or cognitive impairment itself is not the primary source of disability. The actual disability is created by an ableist society that refuses to accommodate human variance.
Oh, that's a huge shift.
To put it simply, the problem isn't that a person uses a wheelchair for mobility. The problem is that society builds stairs instead of ramps. The problem isn't that a person is deaf. The problem is that a hearing-dominant society refuses to provide universal sign language interpretation.
That is a staggering paradigm shift. It completely rewrites the objective of the therapy session.
It does. Under the minority model, the therapeutic focus shifts entirely away from mourning a loss of typical functioning or striving for an unattainable cure.
So what do you focus on instead?
Therapy becomes about fostering self-advocacy, building community empowerment, and developing psychological armor to fight against societal ableism. You help the client build resilience against a world that constantly underestimates and marginalizes them.
The complexity multiplies when we look at intersectionality. The text explores how disability intersects with other identities, like gender, creating these devastating double binds.
Yes.
For example, women with disabilities are routinely desexualized by society. They are viewed as completely asexual, dependent, and are often stripped of traditional societal roles as partners, nurturers, or mothers. Conversely, men with disabilities often struggle intensely with toxic societal expectations of masculinity, which rigidly equate being a real man with physical dominance, endless strength, and total independence.
And this intersectionality gets even more perilous for marginalized groups. Consider the unique, severe vulnerabilities of transgender individuals with disabilities who face extraordinary trauma, gatekeeping, and marginalization from both the medical industrial complex and society at large.
It's just layer upon layer.
Furthermore, within the research, we see the concept of disability acting as a superordinate social category.
Which means that disability operates as a massive blinder for the rest of society, like it trumps everything else about who you are.
Yes. When an individual has a highly visible physical disability, the general public and frequently untrained therapists often stop seeing their race, their gender, their sexuality, or their professional achievement.
They just see the chair.
They only see the wheelchair, the white cane, or the visible impairment. The disability completely overshadows every other complex aspect of their identity, leading to incredibly reductive, infantilizing stereotypes.
Which directly leads to people treating disabled adults like children, or worse, ignoring their basic fundamental humanity. There is a quote in the text from Kelsey Warren, a poet and wheelchair user, that I think perfectly shatters this illusion of the asexual disabled person.
I love this quote.
It also highlights how deeply uncomfortable society, and sadly many therapists, get around the full humanity of disabled folks. She writes, "Cripple copulation may be slightly more complicated, but it is always climactic."
It is a brilliantly provocative quote, and it serves a very specific clinical diagnostic purpose.
Which is
It forces the reader to confront the fact that therapists routinely possess extreme, unexamined discomfort regarding the sexuality, romantic lives, and reproductive desires of their disabled clients.
they just don't want to talk about it.
Because society views people with disabilities as eternal children, therapists frequently fail to even ask about their sexual health, their dating lives, or their desires to have a family. By ignoring these topics, the therapist silently reinforces the crushing ableist idea that those vital parts of the human experience aren't meant for them.
It is a profound form of clinical erasure. All right, we have deeply explored race, immigration, gender, sexuality, and disability. But the literature points us toward one final, ultimate intersection.
The big one.
There is one systemic crushing force that weaves through and massively exacerbates the challenges of every single group we've discussed today. We have to talk about poverty and social class.
It is arguably the most pervasive yet least discussed topic in modern mental health practice. But the empirical data is absolutely irrefutable. Poverty is a primary root cause of severe anxiety, depression, and complex trauma.
It's not just a circumstance, it's a cause.
Living in poverty means existing in a state of constant, unrelenting, chronic stress. It means lying awake, worrying about basic food security, threat of eviction, and exposure to community violence. It fundamentally, biologically alters your nervous system.
There is a concept introduced in the text called minority standard time that absolutely blew my mind because it perfectly illustrates the silent logistical disconnect between a well-meaning middle-class therapist and a client living in poverty. Break down the psychology of how this operates.
Minority standard time refers to the phenomenon where individuals living in poverty are forced by society to view and manage time entirely differently than the middle class.
Okay.
If your survival relies on public assistance, underfunded public health clinics, or notoriously unreliable public transportation, you are sociologically conditioned to wait.
Because you have to.
You might wait 3 hours in a crowded agency waiting room for a 10-minute meeting that will determine if your family gets food stamps that month. The system treats your time as having absolute zero value. You have no autonomy over your schedule.
So take that reality and place it into the context of a private therapy clinic.
A middle-class therapist expects a client to arrive precisely at 2:00 p.m. for a strict 50-minute session. That is the middle-class standard of professionalism. But if the client, who is navigating 3 different bus transfers and a chaotic daily survival schedule, shows up 25 minutes late, how does the therapist react?
Oh, I can guess.
Often they write in their clinical notes, client is resistant, client lacks commitment to the therapeutic process, client has poor boundary management.
Wow.
They pathologize the lateness as an internal psychological flaw, completely missing the external, punishing socioeconomic reality that the client fought through just to show up at all.
That is just heartbreaking. You finally summon the courage to ask for mental health support. You battle a broken transit system to get there, and you are immediately judged and pathologized for the sheer logistics of your survival.
It's incredibly common.
The literature also breaks down the concept of classism, noting that it operates in multiple directions. There is downward classism, which is the systemic bias against the poor, but there's also lateral classism, the crushing pressure to keep up appearances with peers in your same tax bracket.
Right.
And then there is upward classism, which is bias against the affluent. Now, I have to play devil's advocate here. We know the statistics. The mental health gradient clearly shows that more money generally equals better health outcomes, access to better food, safer neighborhoods. So how does upward bias actually harm the therapeutic alliance? Is a therapist really harming a wealthy client by having a bias?
They absolutely can. The social class worldview model revised suggests that therapists operate with myriad unconscious biases that dictate how they dispense empathy.
Okay, that makes sense.
While downward classism is obviously the most structurally devastating, upward bias severely compromises care. A therapist might view a wealthy client as an elitist, assuming their wealth shields them from true suffering, and therefore deeply lack empathy for the very real, severe psychological distress, isolation, or severe substance abuse issues that frequently plague affluent families.
I see.
But more commonly, and often more insidiously, therapists operate with what is called upward mobility bias.
Let's dig into that. What does upward mobility bias look like in action?
It is the unconscious assumption, deeply embedded in the American dream narrative, that everyone's ultimate life goal should naturally be to climb the corporate ladder, acquire more wealth, and achieve higher social status.
Okay.
A therapist infected with this bias might unconsciously push a perfectly content working-class client to go back to night school, to seek a promotion to management, or to leave their blue-collar community.
So they're projecting their own values.
They fail to respect or validate a client who finds immense joy, fulfillment, and meaning in maintaining their current working-class life and community ties. The therapist imposes a middle-class definition of success onto a client who doesn't want it.
And we also have to consider the psychological impact of just walking into the clinic. The text discusses stereotype threat in relation to poverty. Simply asking a client from a lower socioeconomic background to check a box indicating their income bracket on a standard intake form can instantly trigger feelings of shame and deficiency before the therapist even says hello.
Yes, because we live in a society that aggressively and constantly equates financial wealth with inherent human worth.
Right.
But beyond the intake forms, we must examine the very structure of traditional therapy itself. Traditional psychoanalysis demands deep, time-consuming intrapsychic exploration. It involves sitting in a quiet room once a week, reflecting on your childhood attachment styles and your innermost abstract feelings.
Which sounds great if you have the time.
Exactly. For a client who is terrified about their electricity being shut off tomorrow, or who is facing imminent eviction, digging into childhood trauma is a middle-class luxury they simply cannot afford in that moment. They need concrete, tangible, immediate solutions.
Practical help.
They need community resources, fierce advocacy, and active problem-solving. If a therapist insists on rigidly sticking to insight-oriented therapy with a client who is in active survival mode, they're going to alienate that client completely.
The intersectionality of poverty with every single other identity we've discussed today is staggering. The reading references data from the South African National Income Dynamics Study, the NIDS, which found that Black women with disabilities suffer some of the highest, most debilitating rates of depression globally.
It's devastating.
You are looking at the compounding, crushing weight of racism, sexism, ableism, and extreme poverty, all intersecting on one single human being. There is a quote from a participant in the Road Project reaching out about depression that I think serves as the ultimate thesis for this entire discussion. The participant states clearly, "We're people with lives and things in our lives that are affecting our health. Talking about our mental health is not the same as someone who feels down sometimes. If you don't have a roof over your head, if you don't have your electric bill paid, then how are you going to take care of your mental health?" There is not a traditional mental health strategy that gets at that.
That quote perfectly, devastatingly encapsulates the absolute limitation of the traditional clinical model. You cannot treat structural systemic oppression with a deep breathing exercise.
Right.
You cannot CBT your way out of poverty.
Wow. We have covered an immense, challenging, and profoundly important amount of ground today. We've navigated the internal emotional resistance that comes with multicultural awareness, and we've explored the complex intersections of race, immigration, gender, sexuality, disability, and the overarching force of poverty.
It's a lot to process.
It is. If you take one overarching principle away from this deep dive, let it be this. True cultural competence is never about memorizing a static checklist of stereotypes. You can't just memorize a cheat sheet of what to do with a Latino client or an LGBTQ plus client.
No, absolutely not.
It is about adopting and maintaining a lifelong humble stance of curiosity. It's understanding that every single person sitting across from you is a unique, complex intersection of race, class, gender, sexuality, and ability, living within a massive, invisible ecosystem that is either actively supporting them or actively oppressing them.
And if you are a helping professional, or really just a person trying to relate to others, your primary job is to understand that ecosystem, to relentlessly examine your own privileged place within it, and to never, ever assume that your specific view of reality is the only one that exists.
So as we wrap up our time together, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that takes everything we've unpacked today to its logical conclusion. We've established that the entire foundational structure of modern psychotherapy, the standard 50-minute hour, the intense focus on the individual psyche, the required clinical detachment, and the ultimate goal of absolute autonomy was built by and for a very specific, privileged Western demographic.
Right.
If the very walls and foundation of the therapeutic house are built on ethnocentric monoculturalism, is it enough for us to just redecorate the living room with a few cultural adaptations? Or, ultimately, do we need to tear the house down entirely and build a completely new framework from the ground up, based on indigenous, marginalized, and community-based healing? Think about that the next time you look at a diagnostic manual or the next time you find yourself making an assumption about someone's behavior. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.